The Gospel according to John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. The Gospel according to John is a special source text. Students of the scripture will recall that there are special observations about the Gospels, the four Gospels in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Among these several observations made about the Gospels, we can note that each of the writer of the Gospel, they have their own point of view. Each Gospel writer has their purpose for writing. As such, there are stories which can be found in some Gospels but not others. Some story is only found in one, some only in two, some only in three, and some in all four. Each of the writer may choose aspects of a story to include and aspects to leave out so as to bring out their point. Now, John is a very unusual kind of person, as you might remember. And so, John is not a part of the synoptic tradition. And the synoptic, which means same or similar, the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke. The focus here in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, is on the feeding of the 5,000. John's version of the story here is what we will be looking at. Now, here are some interesting points about the feeding of the multitude, which we must note. The feeding of the multitude is controversial in the Gospels. In some place, it mentioned 5,000, and in others, 4,000. I don't know if you ever took note of that. For example, in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21, it mentions 5,000. Same Matthew mentioned 4,000 in Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 through 39. So what is happening here? Is there an error or an oversight on the part of the writer? So when we look further at Matthew's version, it did not only have different numbers, 5,000, then 4,000. It had the story two times, in chapter 14 and then in chapter 15. Isn't that problematic? Okay, so what is happening here? How we can approach this dilemma is in this way. It is that there are two separate events which took place on two separate occasions. There were two separate feedings. The feeding the multitudes is two separate miracles of Jesus reported in the Gospels. The first feeding, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. What we could also note is that there is not only a challenge with the numbering of the crowd, but the numbering of the materials, the food provided. In the first feeding, the 5,000, it says that there were 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The second, the feeding of the 4,000, it has 7 loaves and a few small fish, which was reported by Matthew and Mark, but not by Luke and John. Now let us look on John's purpose for writing. John's purpose for writing is that answering the question, who is Jesus? And that they might believe. So here is the Good Shepherd who is teaching a life of service and arranging a community in which people will serve each other. So in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, there are two observations which I want for us to note. And the first is this, that ministry and evangelism is about partnership. And hear what Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And Jesus said this was to test them because he knew himself what he was about to do. So Jesus was bringing to their attention that ministry and evangelism is about partnership, living in partnership. The second observation is that the resources which we have in ministry, the resources belongs to God. And God's resources are not short. God's hand is not short to provide. There are two subpoints which I want for us to know. The first is this, that God is able to provide in times of crisis. God can, and God can provide in crisis moments. The second observation is that when resources seem short from the ministry, remember that the supply comes from God, to whom the ministry ultimately belongs. For Jesus is the Lord of the harvest. So, what is the goal of all this? The goal which we see is in John chapter 6 and verse 14, which again ties up with John's purpose, why he's writing, so that they might believe. Hear what it says in John chapter 6 and verse 14, the New Revised Standard Version. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." So yes, because of the sign, they had not believed that Jesus is the Messiah.